Kastrup's analytic idealism is Dogmatism and Fallacy, written by Felipe Bautista. Everything which bears any manner of resemblance to an hypothesis is to be treated as contraband. It is not to be put up for sale, even at the lowest price, but forthwith confiscated immediately upon detection. Any knowledge that professes to hold a priori lays claim to be regarded as absolutely necessary. This applies still more to any determination of all pure a priori knowledge, since such determination has to serve as the measure, and therefore as the supreme example, of all apodeictic philosophical certainty. Immanuel Kant. In the present text, we will see precisely how analytic idealism cannot get off the ground, because it not only inescapably involves dogmatism and fallacy, but also very clumsily only reintroduces rather than provides any actual solution to the classical problem of skepticism. We shall withal also see how critical solipsism constitutes a far more superior philosophical offering, on the basis that it involves neither dogmatism nor fallacy, provides an actually satisfactory solution to the classical problem of skepticism, and can legitimately lay claim to be regarded as absolutely necessary. Prior to commencing, however, four very important distinctions must be discussed. The first distinction is that between the immanent and the transcendent. This distinction will be very easily comprehended, I trust, by anyone already sufficiently acquainted with the metaphysics of Kastrup's analytic idealism position. In his Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell book, Kastrup writes about how analytic idealism, quote, acknowledges that there is an external world out there beyond our individual minds, end of quote. In this passage from Kastrup's aforesaid book, we already see particularly clearly the distinction between the immanent and transcendent being made. By the term transcendent, I mean to refer to whatsoever is beyond our individual minds, whereas by immanent, I mean to refer to whatsoever arises in the context of our individual minds. Therefore, by immanent, I mean to refer to the perceptions of the mind. That is, I mean to refer, more broadly speaking, to the representations arising in the context of an individual mind. The houses, mountains, and rivers I perceive, therefore, can legitimately be entitled immanent, because what I call houses, mountains, and rivers, each respectively, are really only syntheses of perceptions arising in the context of an empirical spatio-temporal framework that constitutes that which we may here entitle the experience of consciousness. Therefore, by sheer definition, the term transcendent cannot apply at all to any syntheses of perceptions instantiated in the context of any individual mind. And the term transcendent, by sheer definition, therefore, can legitimately either refer to whatsoever is allegedly beyond our individual minds, or be a meaningless term. The second important distinction is between empirical and transcendental externality. When I use the term external in the empirical sense, I am referring to syntheses of perceptions that appear external to my respective empirical body, such as houses, mountains, and rivers, even if both said syntheses and my empirical body may equally be legitimately classified as ultimately immanent, in the sense that each essentially respectively are syntheses of perceptions arising in one's individual mentation activity. The term external, used in the transcendental sense, then refers to, in Kastrup's own words, any alleged external world out there beyond our individual minds. Very closely related to the distinction between empirical and transcendental externality is the distinction between empirical and transcendental reality. What is real in the empirical sense are the intuitions of sensibility, the syntheses of perceptions, such that the houses, mountains, and rivers of perception can legitimately be entitled real in the empirical sense. In turn, what is meant by real in the transcendental sense is whatsoever is supposed to be real beyond our individual minds. The third important distinction to make here is between the stages on the philosopher's quest, the first being dogmatism, the next being skepticism, and the last being criticism. The stages are distinguished by the mode of philosophizing each implies. The dogmatism and skepticism stages each imply a transcendent mode of philosophizing, whereas the criticism stage necessarily can imply only an immanent mode of philosophizing. A transcendent mode of philosophizing involves theorizing about the relationship between the immanent and transcendent, between the perceptions of the mind and some so-called external world out there, beyond our individual minds. Skepticism involves the transcendent mode of philosophizing also, because its criterion of truth is the transcendental realist, just as the criterion of truth for the dogmatist is also the transcendental realist. Where the dogmatist offers problematic synthetic a priori judgments about how the immanent and transcendent correspond, the skeptic doubts that one can in principle grant any objective validity to any syntheses of perceptions arising in the context of any individual mind's activity, e.g., myself, on the basis that it is simply not possible, either a priori or a posteriori, to obtain any definitively certain knowledge concerning whether there even is any transcendent at all, let alone what its exact nature ultimately may or may not be. Syntheses of perceptions cannot lay claim to objective validity, tells us the skeptic, all the while tacitly presupposing the transcendental realist criterion of truth in his philosophizing procedures. A priori, because it is not logically necessary that there even be any transcendent at all, given the simple fact that metaphysical solipsism, according to which all that literally exists is myself as an individual mind entertaining itself with its own play of immanent representations, is at least a logical possibility. Viz., metaphysical solipsism does not necessarily involve any inherent logical contradiction. Syntheses of perceptions cannot in principle be granted any objective validity, may continue the skeptic, a posteriori, because, as tells us Hume in his first inquiry, it is a question of fact whether the perceptions of the senses be produced by transcendentally external objects. How shall this question be determined? By experience, surely, as all other questions of a like nature. But here, experience is and must be entirely silent. The mind has never anything present to it but the perceptions, and cannot possibly reach any experience of their connection with objects. The supposition of such a connection is, therefore, without any foundation in reasoning. Syntheses of perceptions cannot be granted objective validity a posteriori, may continue the skeptic, because, as puts it Kant, as concerns the sources of metaphysical cognition, its very concept implies that they cannot be empirical. Its principles, including not only its maxims but its basic notions, must never be derived from experience. It must not be physical but metaphysical knowledge, viz., knowledge lying beyond experience. It can therefore have for its basis neither external experience, which is the source of physics proper, nor internal, which is the basis of empirical psychology. It is therefore a priori knowledge coming from pure understanding and pure reason. We see how both, the dogmatist and skeptic, philosophize in terms of the transcendental realist criterion of truth, where the former offers problematic pronouncements concerning not only whether there is a transcendent, but also concerning how said transcendent may even be conceptualized in philosophizing. The latter only doubts that objective validity can be meaningfully attributed to any syntheses of perceptions arising in the context of any individual mind, because neither, whether said syntheses correspond in any meaningful way to any transcendent, nor whether there even is any transcendent at all, cf. metaphysical solipsism, can be proved a priori or a posteriori. The natural next step from skepticism is criticism. Criticism involves an immanent mode of philosophizing, because it neither pronounces concerning any transcendent, that is, it neither affirms nor denies metaphysical solipsism, nor entails the transcendental realist criterion of truth in its procedure. see if Kant's critique of the fourth paralogism and his refutation of idealism respectively, and even see the analogies and schematism too, for more on empirical realism. First of all, however, see the transcendental aesthetic. Criticism involves only an immanent examination of one's mentation activity, whether in terms of its content, phenomenology, or form, critique of pure reason, or in terms of some syntheses of phenomenology and critique of pure reason, as we find, for example, in Friese's empirical psychology. A passage from Beiser's German idealism book may prove instructive here. The significance of the logical and the ineliminability of the psychological aspects of Kant's transcendental discourse mean that ultimately it is necessary to combine both the logical and psychological interpretations. There is no reason to assume that these interpretations must be exclusive. We can consider the transcendental as both logical and psychological, as laying down constraints both about how we ought to think and about how we must do so. There is no fallacy of psychologism in doing so, provided one does not attempt to base normative constraints on psychological laws. Fourthly, let us introduce the distinction between first-order and second-order standpoints. The former is the standpoint of ordinary consciousness, when one's sense of identity arises in connection with some sets of syntheses of perceptions and not in connection with other such sets, e.g., when one identifies as that empirical set of syntheses of perceptions colloquially denominated a man, though not as that other empirical set of syntheses of perceptions colloquially denominated a house. In turn, the second-order standpoint is when one's sense of identity specifically does not arise in connection with some sets of syntheses of perceptions and not in connection with other such sets, viz., when one identifies as a mind interacting with its own immanent representations. To better illustrate the distinction between the first-order and second-order standpoints, let us use the Zhuangzi butterfly dream example. Let us say that a butterfly fell asleep and then began to dream of being a man lost in a scary forest. While in the dream, there is a sense of being lost, because one identifies as a man lost in a scary forest. But then the butterfly wakes up and discovers that it was all a dream. And let us say that this butterfly happens to live in a universe where neither mankind nor the planet Earth ever actually arose. While identifying as a man lost in a forest, the butterfly was caught up in the first-order standpoint by basing sense of identity on some empirical sets of syntheses of perceptions, empirical human body, and not others, scary forest. And even after awakening from the dream, we may have the first-order standpoint arise again if the butterfly then identifies as a butterfly in an empirical environment. Let us suppose that after a while, said butterfly then awakens to discover that it was only a rhinoceros dreaming of being said butterfly, a rhinoceros withal that lives in a universe where neither butterflies nor mankind ever actually arose. Though the thread of the first-order perspective arises once again even here, depending on how identifying plays out as these new sets of syntheses of perceptions now arise in this rhinoceros phase of mentation. To reach the second-order standpoint is to think of oneself as a mind that is somehow accessing its own workings, its own representations, its own activities. A very beautiful expression of the second-order standpoint can be found in Kant's first critique. Experience is an empirical knowledge, that is, a knowledge which determines an object through perceptions. It is a synthesis of perceptions, not contained in perception, but itself containing in one consciousness the synthetic unity of the immanent manifold of perceptions. Kant's observation here presupposes that one has reached that second-order standpoint where the mind can issue commentary about itself and its immanent operations. How even, for example, the tendency to identify arises as a feature of said immanent operations. Having introduced those important distinctions, we may now more satisfactorily enter into a discussion concerning how analytic idealism inescapably is dogmatism and fallacy. By the term dogmatism, we here simply mean to refer to the presumption that it is possible to make progress with pure knowledge according to principles from concepts alone, viz., to that malfeasance of arguing directly from the logical possibility of concepts to the real possibility of things. To better see how analytic idealism is fallacy and dogmatism, let us first refer to an important question raised by Hume in his first inquiry. Namely, by what argument can it be proved that the perceptions of the mind must be caused by 1. Transcendentally external objects entirely different from them, though resembling them if that be possible, and could not arise either from 2. The energy of the mind itself, or from 3. The suggestion of some invisible and unknown spirit, or from 4. Some other cause still more unknown to us. This question of Hume's is very important because it immediately relates to Kastrup's analytic idealism. Let us see how. The question Hume is raising here obviously concerns the nature of the transcendent, viz., concerns the nature of the relationship between the transcendent, however it may be interpreted, and the immanent, the perceptions of the mind. The first of Hume's mentioned 4 possible scenarios corresponds to some variants of naive realism and representational realism, respectively. The second corresponds immediately to metaphysical solipsism, by either denying that there is any transcendent, or denying that any transcendent plays a role in how the mind generates its immanent syntheses of perceptions. The third corresponds to Berkeley's theistic idealism and to Kastrup's analytic idealism. Suggestion may be interpreted as transcendent dissociative processes impinging on the respective dissociative boundaries of respective individual alters, and some invisible and unknown spirit may be interpreted as mind at large. The fourth scenario represents a type of dogmatic radical skepticism, viz., the fourth scenario still involves some tacit commitment to a transcendent, even if remaining agnostic concerning its nature. The main point to take away here is that all 4 of the mentioned scenarios are at the very least logically possible. This means that none can legitimately lay claim to be regarded as absolutely necessary. And because Kastrup's analytic idealism is essentially a species of the third mentioned scenario, analytic idealism, eo ipso, cannot possibly legitimately lay claim to be regarded as absolutely necessary. What all of this means is that analytic idealism has no possible foundation a priori. Viz., it is not logically necessary that there even be any transcendent at all, because metaphysical solipsism, a species of the second-named option, is at the very least logically possible, as are the first and fourth scenarios, and eo ipso their respective corresponding species as well. A fortiori, because it is not even logically necessary that there even be any transcendent at all. It is eo ipso not even logically necessary that there be any Kastrupian mind at large at all, either. The upshot is that analytic idealism cannot find possible support a priori, because it cannot be proved a priori that there must be any transcendent, let alone that a transcendent, should there be any, must be such as conceptualized under analytic idealism. Eo ipso, the analytic idealist must seek foundation a posteriori. Yet the analytic idealist will seek in vain for empirical support, because here experience is and must be entirely silent, and because, as concerns the sources of metaphysical cognition, its very concept implies that they cannot be empirical. It cannot be denied that analytic idealism is a species of metaphysical position, a species of transcendent philosophizing. What follows is that analytic idealism must be guilty of question-begging when pronouncing anything at all concerning any mind at large, the objective validity of the concept of the mind at large, like the objective validity of the concept of the transcendent, not capable of being established either a priori or a posteriori. What I mean here is that analytic idealism does not contingently but necessarily involves fallacy, by involving any pronouncements concerning any transcendent. It does not end there, however. Kastrup's analytic idealism inherently involves argumentum ad lapidem in the classical manner of Dr. Samuel Johnson. For the very same reason that Dr. Johnson's kicking of the stone must fail as an attempt to refute Berkeley, so too must any appeal to whatsoever is empirical, e.g., dissociative identity disorder, on the part of the analytic idealist fail, viz., for the reason that here experience is and must be entirely silent, and because, as concerns the sources of metaphysical cognition, its very concept implies that they cannot be empirical. The analytic idealist may attempt to appeal to conceptual parsimony and explanatory power, but here he'd only confirm that analytic idealism necessarily involves dogmatism. A concept is always possible if it is not self-contradictory. This is the logical criterion of possibility, and by it the object of the concept is distinguishable from the nihil negativum. But it may nonetheless be an empty concept, unless the objective reality of the synthesis through which the concept is generated has been specifically proved. And such proof rests on principles of possible experience, and not on the principle of analysis, the law of contradiction. This is a warning against arguing directly from the logical possibility of concepts to the real possibility of things. Another fallacy that inescapably pertains to analytic idealism is the non sequitur. It simply does not follow from the fact, or in Fichtean terms Tathandlung, of any instantiation of sets of syntheses of perceptions arising in the context of one's individual mentation activity, that there must be any transcendent at all. Nor can the analytic idealist make any appeals to volition here without thereby necessarily begging the question, without thereby, that is, unabashedly taking for granted that there is a transcendent. Because even in dreams and hallucinations I notice sets of syntheses of perceptions arising in the context of my mentation activity that, though seemingly independent of my volition, need not necessarily involve any actual reference whatsoever to any so-called transcendent, transcendentally external with respect to the same. Question begging is embedded into the very framework of analytic idealism. That the fallacy of hypostasis is also implicit in analytic idealism is obvious. The analytic idealist egregiously hypostatizes at least the a priori forms of sensibility when postulating a transcendent, worse, a transcendent whose reality cannot even in principle be proved a priori or a posteriori, and even unabashedly is guilty of deploying an illegitimate transcendent application of the categories beyond their legitimate role in the structuring of the syntheses of perceptions arising in the context of one's mentation activity. The category of relation, for instance, is already necessarily implied in discussion of any alleged ex hypothesi transcendent mind-at-large system, which allegedly dissociates into respective alters. It is not that I cannot think any alleged problematic or hypothetical transcendent according to the concepts of the understanding. C. F. Beiser, German Idealism, Harvard University Press, 2002, page 96. Rather, it is that because it is not even logically necessary that there be any transcendent at all to begin with, eo ipso arguing directly from the logical possibility of concepts to the real possibility of things must involve not only question-begging but tacit reification. How analytic idealism only clumsily reintroduces rather than provides any solution to the classical problem of skepticism is obvious. Analytic idealism presupposes the transcendental realist criterion of truth by taking for granted, petitio principii, that the objectivity of the mind's perceptions is explainable in terms of transcendental affection, viz., in terms of relations between transcendent activity impinging on the exterior portion of the dissociative boundaries of different respective centers of mentation arising, in relation to both one another and the mind at large framework more generally speaking, within the framework of mind at large. The precise reason why Descartes even instituted his doubt was because he presupposed the transcendental realist criterion of truth in his investigations. If immanent perceptions arising in individual minds must have some correspondence or connection to some alleged transcendent, mind at large or what have you, and if such connection cannot possibly be even proved to be the case a priori or a posteriori, then analytic idealism essentially and inescapably, ipso facto, actually invites the problem of skepticism. How then does critical solipsism avoid dogmatism and fallacy? Well, by definition, criticism involves the second-order standpoint. And because critical solipsism is a species of criticism, ipso, critical solipsism has nothing to do with the first-order standpoint at all. The first-order standpoint, as we have already seen, being connected to not criticism, but dogmatism. Critical solipsism, further, can be made consistent with each of the four scenarios mentioned by Hume in his above question. Because criticism only involves the mind's immanent study of itself and its own immanent operations, ipso critical solipsism, a species of criticism, does not at all depend on whether the first, second, third, or fourth of Hume's named possible scenarios is the case, such that the critical solipsist need not enter into any dogmatic dialectic concerning which of Hume's named possible scenarios must be the case. Instead, therefore, of rushing into the fight sword in hand, we should rather play the part of the peaceable onlooker, from the safe seat of the critic. The struggle is indeed toilsome to the combatants, but for us can be entertaining. And its outcome, certain to be quite bloodless, must be of advantage as contributing to our theoretical insight. For it is indeed absurd to look to reason for enlightenment, and yet to prescribe beforehand which side she must necessarily favor. Besides, reason is already of itself so confined and held within limits by reason that we have no need to call out the guard with a view to bringing the civil power to bear upon that party whose alarming superiority may seem to us to be dangerous. In this pre-critical speculative metaphysics dialectic, no victory is gained that need give us cause for anxiety. By definition, critical solipsism avoids dogmatism. Because critical solipsism avoids dogmatism by definition, ipso, it does not run into the fallacies characteristic of analytic idealism. The critical solipsist need not beg the question in pronouncing concerning the transcendent, since he specifically avoids pronouncing concerning any transcendent. He need not commit any non sequitur because he does not infer any transcendent from the fact or Tathandlung of sets of syntheses of perceptions arising in and as one's immanent mentation activity, etc. The classical problem of skepticism does not arise for the critical solipsist because the skeptic and the critical solipsist share a common standpoint, the second-order standpoint. Prima facie, it may seem inconsistent to suggest that skepticism entails both the second-order standpoint and a transcendent mode of philosophizing. But these can be reconciled in the case of skepticism because, though skepticism acknowledges that the supposition of such a connection between any transcendent and the immanent is without any foundation in reasoning, thereby embodying the second-order standpoint ipso. The skeptic's doubts emerge from his taking for granted the transcendental realist criterion of truth, thereby guilty of tacit, transcendent philosophizing as well. For the critical solipsist, the classical problem of skepticism does not and cannot even arise, specifically because the critical solipsist repudiates the very transcendental realist criterion of truth that even enables classical skepticism in the first place. The critical solipsist, because his method of approach involves not only the second-order standpoint, but also immanent philosophizing, can in principle achieve something that the dogmatist cannot, viz., obtain a priori support for his respective philosophical offering, critical solipsism. The attempt to provide any satisfactory solution to the classical problem of skepticism and the quest for apodeictic certainty and philosophizing are inextricably linked. It is ironic that Kastrup himself tacitly endorses critical solipsism when he writes in his Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell book about how we are always cooped up in our own mentation. Kastrup is here in effect raising the banner of critical solipsism, since critical solipsism can satisfactorily be summed up as the view that we are always cooped up in our own mentation, or more specifically that one is always cooped up in one's own mentation activity. How is critical solipsism apodeictic? Well, critical solipsism does not depend on which of Hume's forenamed scenarios is the case, so there is a certain universality in critical solipsism. And critical solipsism, viz., that we are always cooped up in our own mentation, remains true irrespective of which of Hume's named possible scenarios is the case, such that there is a certain universality and necessity involved in critical solipsism. An important distinction between metaphysical and critical solipsism should be made here. The former constitutes a dogmatic position about transcendental reality, outright denying that there is any transcendent, while critical solipsism involves no such dogmatism, but constitutes a critical methodological stance regarding what can be known with apodeictic certainty. Critical solipsism may be compatible with, but not equivalent to, metaphysical solipsism, but only because of its universality and necessity, because, that is, it is compatible with any of the four scenarios mentioned in Hume's important question. To provide some concluding obiter dicta on irony, I want to point out a rich irony in how Kastrup presents his analytic idealism. Kastrup denounces materialism on the basis that matter is an explanatory abstraction, that is, not an observable fact. This is highly ironic because his mind at large is precisely not an observable fact, but an explanatory abstraction. Furthermore, matter colloquially understood at least has empirical reality, whereas the mind at large cannot in principle have any empirical reality, and the transcendental reality of the alleged mind at large cannot be possibly substantiated a priori or a posteriori. The mind at large hypothesis is without any foundation in reasoning, and if one sympathizes with it, it is only on the basis of prejudice and predilection, not on the basis of reasoning, since the mind at large hypothesis has no possible foundation, either a priori or a posteriori. It is also invincibly ironic that Kastrup writes in his Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell book as follows, quote, I've learned over time what the main difficulties are that different people have with analytic idealism and refined ways to explain it so to meet people where they are, honoring their intuitions and tackling their hidden assumptions more explicitly. End of quote. It is invincibly ironic that Kastrup so writes, because the mind-at-large hypothesis is itself an egregious assumption, worse, not even a hidden but an unabashed assumption, viz. Is egregious petitio principii. Another irony is how Kastrup writes in his Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell book that, quote, obviously, it is us human beings who come up with our own descriptions of our perceptual experience of an external world. The thing that is ultimately described through its physical representation, i.e., that which is represented, is out there, while the descriptions themselves are in here, so to speak. But the physicalist flips this upside down, or rather inside out. It is only the descriptions that are out there, i.e., the kilograms, the meters, the liters, the seconds, etc., while the things described somehow arise from and are given substance by the descriptions. This is literally equivalent to stating that the map precedes the territory, and somehow generates the territory." End of quote. It is highly ironic that Kastrup writes this way because his analytic idealism is precisely equivalent to stating that the map precedes the territory and somehow generates the territory. That is, Kastrup invents this fantasy of a so-called mind at large, and then in blatant question-begging and pre-critical dogmatic fashion, takes for granted that this fantasy of his somehow is the source of the perceptions of the mind. That Kastrup's analytic idealism is clumsy, pre-critical dogmatism and unabashed question-begging, and outright fantasizing, outright building castles in the air, is irremediably obvious. Although we had contemplated building a tower which should reach to the heavens, the supply of materials suffices only for a dwelling house just sufficiently commodious for our business on the level of experience, and just sufficiently high to allow of our overlooking it. All metaphysicians are therefore solemnly and legally suspended from their occupations till they shall have answered in a satisfactory manner the question, how are synthetic cognitions a priori possible? For in this answer alone consists the credential which they must present if they have anything to offer in the name of pure reason. But if they do not possess these credentials, they can expect nothing else of reasonable people, who have been deceived so often, than to be dismissed without further ado.